The sound of hurried footsteps on the basement stairs jolted Margaret from her thoughts. She was standing in the kitchen, drying her hands on a dish towel, when her son's voice rang out, sharp, urgent, and unlike anything she'd ever heard from him before. "Grandma, we're leaving, now!" The words echoed through the house, slicing through the Sunday calm like a knife. Margaret's heart lurched. She turned just in time to see her son, Daniel, burst into the kitchen, his face ashen, his eyes wide with a fear she hadn't seen since he was a child. Behind him, his wife, Rachel, clutched their 2 children, her knuckles white around their small wrists. The children's faces were pale, their eyes darting between their parents and their grandmother, confusion and fear mingling in their expressions. Margaret's mind raced. She had never seen Daniel like this, not even when he'd broken his arm falling from the old oak tree, not when he'd lost his first job, not even when his own father had passed away. He was always the calm one, the steady one, the one who reassured everyone else. But now, he looked at her as if she were a stranger, as if the house itself had turned against them. "What's wrong?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. "What happened down there?" Daniel shook his head, glancing over his shoulder as if something might follow him up from the darkness below. "We have to go. Get your things? We're not staying here another minute." Rachel's voice was barely more than a whisper. "Daniel, please! You're scaring the children!" But Daniel didn't answer. He just kept moving, ushering his family toward the front door, his hand never leaving the small of Rachel's back. Margaret stood frozen, the dish towel clutched in her hands. She looked at her grandchildren, little Emma, clutching her stuffed rabbit, and Ben, his lower lip trembling. "It's okay, darlings," she tried to say, but the words felt hollow. She wanted to reach out, to comfort them, but Daniel's urgency was contagious. The air in the house felt suddenly heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. "What did you see?" Margaret asked again, her voice firmer this time. Daniel paused at the door, his hand on the knob, his eyes meeting hers for a brief, haunted moment. "Just trust me, Mom. We have to leave, now." He opened the door, and the family spilled out into the fading afternoon light, leaving Margaret standing alone in the kitchen, her heart pounding in her chest. She listened as the car doors slammed, as the engine roared to life, as the tires crunched down the gravel driveway, then silence. The house, once filled with laughter and the clatter of dishes, was now eerily still. Margaret's mind spun with questions. What could have frightened Daniel so badly? What was lurking in the basement that had sent her family fleeing into the street? She took a shaky breath, her eyes drifting to the basement door. It stood ajar, a sliver of darkness yawning at the top of the stairs. She wanted to go down, to see for herself, but her legs wouldn't move. Instead, she sank into a chair at the kitchen table, the dish towel still clenched in her fists. She tried to piece together the last few hours, searching for anything out of the ordinary, a strange smell, a sound, a shadow. But nothing came to mind. Everything had seemed so normal, so safe. Margaret's thoughts raced back to the morning, to the way Daniel had insisted on fixing the old fuse box in the basement, to Rachel's nervous glances, to the children's restless energy. Had she missed something? Had there been a warning she hadn't seen? She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the rapid thud of her heart. She was no stranger to fear. She'd lived through war, through loss, through the slow ache of growing old. But this was different. This was a fear that came from not knowing, from being left behind. The house felt colder now, the shadows longer. Margaret's mind filled with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Was it a gas leak? A wild animal? Something worse? She tried to steady her breathing, to remind herself that she was strong, that she had survived worse. But the uncertainty gnawed at her, a silent question echoing in the empty rooms. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Margaret sat alone in the kitchen, the weight of her family's fear pressing down on her. She knew that whatever had happened in the basement, whatever had driven Daniel to flee, was only the beginning. The real story, the truth, was still waiting in the darkness below. But before she could face it, before she could find the answers she so desperately needed, she had to remember how it all began. She had to go back to the days before the fear, before the panic, before the secrets started to unravel. Earlier that week, Margaret's life had been quiet, almost peaceful. She woke each morning to the sound of birds outside her window, made herself a cup of tea, and watched the sun rise over the garden she'd tended for decades. She called her sister, checked the mail, and sometimes baked a pie for the neighbors. She thought she knew her family. She thought she knew herself. But she was about to discover just how wrong she was. Margaret's house was the kind of place that felt like a warm embrace. It was a modest 2-story home with faded green shutters and a garden that overflowed with wildflowers and herbs. The front porch creaked underfoot, and the kitchen always smelled faintly of cinnamon and fresh bread. Every corner of the house held a memory, the pencil marks on the doorframe where she'd measured her children's heights, the faded quilt draped over the sofa that her mother had sewn by hand, the old cuckoo clock that had belonged to her grandmother. It was a house built on love, sacrifice, and the quiet strength of a woman who had weathered more storms than most. Margaret had always been the matriarch, the one everyone turned to in times of trouble. She'd raised 3 children on her own after her husband died young, working 2 jobs to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. She'd never complained, never asked for help, never let her children see how tired she was. She was the glue that held the family together, the steady hand that guided them through every crisis. Her children, Daniel, her eldest, Sarah, her only daughter, and Peter, her youngest, had grown up knowing that their mother would do anything for them. But as the years passed, Margaret began to notice the subtle ways she was being pushed to the margins. Daniel, always the responsible one, had married Rachel, a woman with a sharp tongue and a talent for making Margaret feel small. Rachel was efficient, organized, and utterly convinced that she knew best. She took over holiday dinners, rearranged the furniture when she visited, and gently suggested that maybe Margaret should let the younger generation handle things now. Margaret tried not to mind. She told herself it was natural, that children grow up and make their own lives. But sometimes, when she sat alone in her kitchen, she wondered when exactly she had become invisible. Sarah lived 2 states away, busy with her own family and career. She called every Sunday, but the conversations were always rushed, full of updates about the kids and complaints about her husband. Peter, the baby of the family, had drifted away after a falling out with Daniel years ago. He called on birthdays and sent cards at Christmas, but he rarely visited. Margaret missed him fiercely, but she had learned not to ask too many questions. Despite the distance, Margaret did her best to stay connected. She baked cookies for her grandchildren, sent cards for every occasion, and never forgot a birthday. She kept a scrapbook of every drawing, every photo, every letter. She made sure the house was always ready for visitors, just in case someone decided to drop by. She kept a pot of soup simmering on the stove, a plate of cookies on the counter, and a light in the window every night. She told herself that was enough, that being the quiet backbone of the family was its own reward. But sometimes, she wondered what would happen if she stopped. If she stopped calling, stopped baking, stopped reminding them of all the little things that held them together. Would they notice? Would they care? Or would they simply move on, their lives unchanged by her absence? Rachel, in particular, had a way of making Margaret feel like a guest in her own home. She was always polite, always gracious, but there was a distance in her eyes, a way she had of making Margaret feel like an inconvenience. She managed the family's finances, planned the vacations, decided where the children would go to school. If she thought something was a waste of time, it was dismissed with a wave of her hand. If she thought Margaret was being sentimental or old-fashioned, she'd smile and say, "Oh, Margaret, you're so sweet," as if she were a child who needed humoring. Margaret tried to stay out of her way, to be helpful without being intrusive, but it was like walking a tightrope, one wrong step, and she'd be reminded of her place. Daniel, caught between his wife and his mother, had grown distant. He used to call every Sunday, just to check in, to tell her about work or the kids or the new project he was building in the garage. But after Rachel came into the picture, the calls grew shorter, less frequent. He was always busy, always tired, always promising to visit next weekend. The grandchildren. Emma and Ben were sweet kids, but even they seemed to drift away, caught up in their own lives, their own friends, their own screens. Still, Margaret loved them all fiercely. She kept her worries to herself, never wanting to be a burden. She told herself that families change, that children grow up and move on. But sometimes, late at night, she wondered if she had given too much, if she had made herself so useful, so dependable, that they'd forgotten she was a person with feelings of her own. One afternoon, as she was dusting the shelves in the living room, Margaret found an old letter tucked behind a stack of books. The envelope was yellowed with age, the handwriting familiar. It was from her late husband, written just before he died. She sat down and read it, tears pricking her eyes as she remembered the promises they'd made to each other, the dreams they'd shared. "Promise me you'll never let anyone take this house from you," he'd written. "It's your home, Margaret. It's your legacy." As she folded the letter and slipped it into her apron pocket, the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Margaret hesitated, then answered. "Mrs. Thompson?" a man's voice said. "This is Mr. Harris from Harris & Associates. I'm calling on behalf of your son and daughter-in-law. They'd like to discuss some important family matters with you. Would you be available for a meeting this week?" Margaret's heart skipped. She agreed to the meeting, her mind racing with questions. What could be so urgent? Why hadn't Daniel called her himself? She hung up, the warmth of the afternoon fading into a chill that settled deep in her bones. If only they knew what she was hiding. If only they remembered who she was before she became the person they took for granted. As the sun set, Margaret sat at the kitchen table, the letter from her husband in her lap, and wondered what was coming next. She had a feeling that everything was about to change, and not in the way anyone expected. The day started like any other family gathering, with the kitchen full of laughter, the clatter of dishes, and the smell of Margaret's famous apple pie baking in the oven. Daniel and Rachel had brought the children, and for a while, the house felt alive again. Margaret watched Emma and Ben chase each other through the hallway, their giggles echoing off the walls. Rachel was setting the table, her movements brisk and efficient, while Daniel fiddled with the old radio, trying to find a station that everyone could agree on. For a moment, Margaret allowed herself to believe that everything was as it should be, that the distance and tension of the past few years had melted away in the warmth of family. But then, as Margaret was pouring lemonade, the lights flickered and went out. The radio died mid-song, and the oven's hum faded into silence. Rachel sighed, her annoyance barely concealed. "Not again," she muttered, glancing at Daniel. "Can you check the fuse box? I told you we should have had an electrician look at it." Daniel rolled his eyes, but headed for the basement, flashlight in hand. Margaret felt a twinge of embarrassment. She'd meant to call someone about the flickering lights, but it had slipped her mind. She tried to brush it off, telling herself it was just another sign of the house's age. The minutes ticked by. The children grew restless, and Rachel's irritation grew. "What's taking him so long?" she asked, her voice sharp. Margaret tried to reassure her, but she felt a knot of worry forming in her stomach. Daniel was usually quick with these things. She listened for the sound of his footsteps, but the house was eerily quiet. Suddenly, there was a crash from the basement, followed by Daniel's voice, loud, panicked, and completely unlike him. "Mom! Rachel! Come down here now!" The urgency in his tone sent a chill down Margaret's spine. Rachel looked at her, eyes wide, then hurried toward the basement door. Margaret followed, her heart pounding. They found Daniel standing at the bottom of the stairs, flashlight trembling in his hand. He was staring at the far wall, his face pale. Margaret's eyes followed his gaze, and for a moment she saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the old shelves, boxes of Christmas decorations, and Henry's dusty workbench. But then Daniel pointed, his hand shaking. "What is that?" he demanded. Margaret stepped closer, squinting in the dim light. There behind a stack of boxes was a small locked trunk she hadn't seen in years. It was covered in dust, the lock rusted, but something about it made her uneasy. Daniel moved the boxes aside and yanked at the trunk, dragging it into the open. He looked at Margaret, his expression a mix of anger and fear. "What's in here, Mom?" Margaret shook her head, her mind racing. I don't remember. It's been there since before your father died." Daniel didn't wait for an explanation. He found a hammer on the workbench and smashed the lock. The trunk creaked open, and a musty smell filled the air. Inside were stacks of old papers, photographs, and a small velvet pouch. Daniel rifled through the contents, his hands growing more frantic with each passing second. He pulled out a bundle of letters, tied with a faded ribbon. He read the first few lines, his face growing even paler. "Mom, what is this?" "These are from Uncle George. He's talking about money, about the house, about some kind of deal." "Why didn't you ever tell us about this?" Margaret's mind reeled. She remembered George, her late husband's brother, and the arguments they'd had after Henry's death. She remembered the threats, the promises, the way she'd hidden the letters away, hoping to forget the pain. She tried to explain, but Daniel cut her off. "There's more," he said, pulling out a stack of legal documents. "These are deeds, wills, Mom. Some of these are signed by people I've never even heard of." "What is all this?" Rachel stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "Were you hiding something from us, Margaret? Is this why you never wanted to talk about the house?" Margaret felt the room spinning. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. She looked at Daniel, at Rachel, at the children peering down the stairs, their faces full of fear. She realized, with a sinking feeling, that the trust she'd spent a lifetime building was crumbling before her eyes. Daniel stood up, clutching the letters and documents. "We're leaving," he said, his voice cold. "We need to figure out what's going on here. I can't believe you kept this from us." Rachel gathered the children, her face set in a hard line. Margaret watched as they hurried up the stairs, her heart breaking. She wanted to call after them, to explain, to beg them to stay, but she knew it was too late. As the door slammed shut behind them, Margaret sank to the basement floor, surrounded by the ghosts of her past. She stared at the open trunk, at the secrets she'd tried so hard to bury, and wondered how everything had gone so wrong. What could be so terrible in the basement? What had she been hiding from herself all these years? The answers were there, in the letters, in the deeds, in the memories she'd tried to forget. But now, with her family gone and her world turned upside down, Margaret knew she would have to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The house felt impossibly empty after Daniel and his family left. Margaret wandered from room to room, her footsteps echoing in the silence, the air heavy with the scent of dust and old memories. She kept replaying the moment in the basement, Daniel's pale face, Rachel's accusing glare, the children's frightened eyes. The trunk still sat open at the foot of the stairs, its contents scattered across the floor like the pieces of a life she'd tried to keep hidden. She wanted to close it, to shove everything back inside and pretend none of it had ever happened, but she knew that was no longer possible. She spent the next day in a fog, barely able to eat or sleep. Every time the phone rang, her heart leapt, hoping it was Daniel calling to say he understood, that he forgave her, that they could talk. But it was always someone else, a neighbor asking if she was all right, a telemarketer, Victoria checking in. Margaret tried to sound normal, but her voice was thin, her words clipped. She didn't know how to explain what had happened, didn't know how to admit that her own son now looked at her as if she were a stranger. The pain of Daniel's betrayal was sharper than she'd expected. She'd always known their relationship was complicated, that Rachel's influence had changed him, but she'd never imagined he would turn on her so completely. She thought of all the times she'd stayed up late helping him with homework, the scraped knees she'd bandaged, the nights she'd sat by his bed when he was sick. She remembered the way he used to run to her after school, his arms flung wide, his face lit up with joy. Where had that little boy gone? When had he become a man who could look at his mother with suspicion and anger? Rachel's manipulations became more obvious in the days that followed. She called Margaret, her tone icy and formal. "We need to talk about the house, Margaret. Daniel and I have spoken to a lawyer. There are questions about the ownership, about the documents you've been hiding. If you don't cooperate, we'll have no choice but to take legal action." Margaret tried to explain, to tell her side of the story, but Rachel cut her off. "You've kept secrets for too long. It's time to come clean." Margaret hung up, her hands shaking. She felt trapped, cornered in her own home. She started to notice the way neighbors looked at her when she went to the market, the way conversation stopped when she entered a room. She heard whispers about the trunk in the basement, about old secrets coming to light. The shame was suffocating, but in the quiet moments, when the house was still and the world outside seemed far away, Margaret found herself remembering happier times. She remembered Christmas mornings, the house filled with laughter and the smell of cinnamon rolls. She remembered summer evenings on the porch, watching the fireflies with Henry, their hands entwined. She remembered the pride she'd felt when Daniel graduated, the joy of holding her grandchildren for the first time. Those memories were bittersweet now, reminders of everything she stood to lose. One afternoon, as she was sorting through the papers from the trunk, Margaret found a letter she didn't recognize. It was addressed to her, but the handwriting was unfamiliar. She opened it, her hands trembling. The letter was from a woman named Evelyn, someone she'd never met. Evelyn wrote about a debt Henry had paid off for her years ago, about a promise he'd made to keep her secret safe. She thanked Margaret for her kindness, for her understanding, and apologized for any pain she might have caused. The letter was dated just a few months before Henry's death. Margaret read the letter over and over, trying to make sense of it. She realized that Henry had been hiding something from her, something that had to do with the house, with the trunk, with the documents Daniel had found. She felt a surge of anger at Henry, at herself, at the whole tangled mess of secrets and lies. But beneath the anger was something else, a glimmer of understanding, a sense that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. Victoria became her confidant, her anchor in the storm. She came over every day, bringing food, comfort, and a listening ear. "You can't let them bully you, Margaret," she said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set. "You have rights. You have a story. Don't let Rachel rewrite it." Lily, too, became an unexpected ally. She started visiting after school, helping Margaret sort through the papers, asking questions about the past. "Grandma, I believe you," she said one afternoon, her voice fierce. "I know you're not hiding anything bad. I know you're just trying to protect us." Margaret clung to their support, drawing strength from their faith in her. She started to fight back, gathering evidence, making notes, preparing for the battle she knew was coming. She met with a lawyer, explained the situation, and handed over the documents she'd found. The lawyer listened carefully, nodding as Margaret spoke. "You have a strong case," he said. "But you need to be ready. Rachel is determined. She'll do whatever it takes to win." The pressure mounted as the court date approached. Rachel spread rumors, telling anyone who would listen that Margaret was unstable, that she was hiding money, that she'd lied about the house for years. Daniel stopped answering Margaret's calls, his silence more painful than any accusation. The grandchildren were caught in the middle, unsure who to believe. Margaret's nights were restless, filled with dreams of the past, of Henry, of the children when they were small, of the house when it was new. She woke each morning with a sense of dread, but also with a growing determination. She would not let Rachel take everything from her. She would not let her family's story be twisted into something ugly and false. One evening, as Margaret was locking up for the night, she heard voices outside the window. She crept to the door and listened. Rachel and Daniel were arguing in the driveway, their voices low but urgent. "You promised me this would be easy," Rachel hissed. "You said your mother would just sign the papers and be done with it." "She's tougher than I thought," Daniel replied, his voice weary. "She's not giving up." "Then we'll have to push harder," Rachel said. "If she won't cooperate, we'll make her look incompetent. We'll get the neighbors to say she's forgetful. We'll find a doctor who'll back us up. I'm not losing this house, Daniel. Not after everything I've done." Margaret's blood ran cold. She realized, in that moment, just how far Rachel was willing to go. But she also realized something else. She was done being afraid. She was done letting other people decide her fate. The next morning, Margaret called her lawyer and told him everything she'd overheard. "We need to be ready," she said. "They're going to try to discredit me. But I'm not backing down." Her lawyer agreed, and together they began to build a strategy. Margaret gathered letters from friends and neighbors, proof of her competence and independence. She documented every conversation, every threat, every attempt Rachel made to undermine her. She started keeping a journal, recording her thoughts and feelings, her memories and hopes. As the court date drew closer, Margaret felt a strange sense of calm. She knew the battle would be hard, that she might lose more than just the house. But she also knew she wasn't alone. She had Victoria. She had Lily. She had the truth on her side, but the worst was yet to come. One night, as Margaret was sorting through the last of the papers from the trunk, she found a hidden compartment. Inside was a small leather-bound notebook, Henry's journal. She opened it, her hands trembling, and began to read. The entries were full of love and regret, of secrets kept and promises broken. In the final pages, Henry confessed to a deal he'd made with George, a deal that put the house at risk if certain conditions weren't met. He wrote of his fear that Margaret would be left alone, of his hope that she would find the strength to fight for what was hers. Margaret closed the journal, tears streaming down her face. She realized that the battle she was fighting wasn't just for herself, it was for Henry, for their children, for the legacy they'd built together. She wiped her eyes, squared her shoulders, and prepared for the fight of her life. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, Henry's journal open before her, the words blurring as she read them again and again. The confession was there in black and white. Henry had made a deal with his brother George, a desperate attempt to save the house after a string of bad investments. The agreement was complicated, full of legal jargon, but one thing was clear: if certain payments weren't made, George's heirs could claim a stake in the property. Margaret's hands shook as she realized what this meant. All these years, she'd believed the house was hers, safe and secure, but now she saw how fragile her claim really was. She felt a wave of anger at Henry for keeping this from her, for leaving her to face the consequences alone. But beneath the anger was something else, a spark of determination. She would not let her life's work be undone by secrets and lies. She would not let Rachel and Daniel use this against her. She would fight, not just for herself, but for Henry's memory, for the family they had built together. Margaret called Mark, her lawyer, and read him the relevant passages from the journal. He listened in silence, then said, "This changes everything. If we can prove that George's heirs never made a claim, and that you've maintained the property all these years, we can argue that the house is rightfully yours. But we'll need documentation, bank records, tax receipts, anything that shows you've been the sole caretaker." Margaret spent the next few days combing through old files, digging up every scrap of evidence she could find. She found receipts for repairs, letters from the bank, even a faded photograph of her and Henry painting the front porch together. Each piece of paper was a small victory, a reminder of the life they had shared, the sacrifices they had made. Lily became her partner in the search, her youthful energy a balm for Margaret's weary spirit. Together, they sorted through boxes in the attic, laughing at old photos, sharing stories, and growing closer than they had in years. One afternoon, as they sifted through a box of Henry's tools, Lily found a sealed envelope tucked inside a rusted coffee can. Inside was a notarized letter from George, dated years after the original agreement, stating that he had no interest in the house and that all claims were null and void. Margaret stared at the letter, hardly daring to believe it. This was the proof she needed, the evidence that would turn the whole case upside down. She hugged Lily, tears streaming down her face. "You found it, sweetheart. You saved us." Lily grinned, her eyes shining with pride. "We did it together, Grandma." Lily grinned, her eyes shining with pride. "We did it together, Grandma." Margaret called Mark immediately, and he nearly shouted with excitement when she told him about the letter. "This is it, Margaret. This is the smoking gun. With this, we can prove that the house is yours, free and clear. Rachel and Daniel don't have a leg to stand on." But Margaret knew the fight wasn't over. She could feel Rachel's desperation growing, could sense the way she watched the house from her car parked down the street, the way she questioned neighbors, the way she tried to turn the community against Margaret. The closer Margaret got to victory, the more dangerous Rachel became. Margaret moved with a new sense of purpose, her steps lighter, her mind sharper than it had been in years. She made copies of every important document, storing them in different places, one set with Mark, another with Victoria, and a third hidden in her own home. She rehearsed her testimony, practiced answering difficult questions, and even started keeping a daily log of her activities, just in case Rachel tried to claim she was forgetful or confused. Each small act of preparation was a quiet rebellion, a way of reclaiming control over her life. But Rachel was watching. Margaret noticed her car parked at the end of the block more often, saw her talking to neighbors, sometimes even caught her peering through the hedge. One evening, as Margaret was watering her garden, Rachel appeared at the gate, her smile brittle. "You're making this very difficult, Margaret," she said, her voice low. "Why not just sign the house over and save everyone the trouble?" Margaret met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "Because it's my home, and I'm not giving up without a fight." Rachel's eyes narrowed. "You think you're clever, but you're just an old woman clinging to the past. Daniel and I will win. We always do." Margaret watched her walk away, her heart pounding but her resolve unshaken. She knew Rachel was desperate, that she would stop at nothing to get what she wanted. But Margaret was no longer afraid. She had the truth on her side, and for the first time, she believed that was enough. That night, as Margaret prepared for bed, she found a note slipped under her door. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was clear. "Back down, or you'll regret it." Margaret stared at the note, her hands trembling. For a moment, the old fear threatened to return, but she pushed it aside. She was done being intimidated. She tucked the note into her journal, another piece of evidence for Mark. The next morning, Margaret met with Mark and Victoria to finalize their strategy. They reviewed the evidence, rehearsed their arguments, and made a plan for every possible scenario. Mark was confident, Victoria was encouraging, and Margaret felt ready. She knew the trial would be hard, that Rachel would do everything in her power to discredit her, but she also knew she wasn't alone. As the day of the trial approached, Margaret found herself reflecting on everything she had learned. She realized that her strength didn't come from the house, or from Henry's memory, or even from the documents she had found. It came from within, from the quiet determination that had carried her through every hardship, from the love she had for her family, from the belief that she deserved to be heard. The night before the trial, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by the evidence of her life. She wrote a letter to Lily, thanking her for her help, for her faith, for reminding her what family really meant. She wrote another to Henry, promising to honor his memory by fighting for the home they had built together. She went to bed with a sense of peace, knowing she had done everything she could. But as she drifted off to sleep, she couldn't shake the feeling that Rachel had one last move to play. The battle wasn't over yet. The real test was still to come. Margaret's kitchen became the headquarters for her quiet rebellion. The table was covered in neat stacks of documents, color-coded folders, and a spiral notebook where she recorded every phone call, every conversation, every memory that might matter. Victoria was there nearly every day, her sharp mind and quick wit a comfort as they pored over old tax returns, utility bills, and letters from Henry. Mark, her lawyer, called each morning with updates and advice, his voice steady and reassuring. Lily, too, became a regular presence, her youthful energy and tech skills invaluable as she scanned documents, organized files, and even set up a secure email account for Margaret to communicate with Mark. Margaret felt herself changing. The fear and humiliation that had once paralyzed her were replaced by a sense of purpose. She was no longer just reacting, she was planning, anticipating, thinking several steps ahead. She learned to read legal documents, to ask the right questions, to trust her instincts. She started keeping a daily log, documenting her routines, her interactions, her thoughts. Each entry was a small act of defiance, a way of proving to herself and to anyone who might question her that she was still sharp, still capable, still in control. But Rachel was relentless. She called Margaret at all hours, sometimes pleading, sometimes threatening. "You're making a mistake, Margaret. If you go through with this, you'll lose everything. You'll be alone." Margaret stopped answering the phone, letting Victoria screen the calls. She changed the locks on her doors, installed new security cameras, and made sure her neighbors knew to keep an eye out for anything unusual. She even started carrying a small notebook in her purse, jotting down anything that seemed suspicious. The pressure mounted as the court date approached. Rachel spread rumors at church, telling anyone who would listen that Margaret was losing her memory, that she'd left the stove on, that she'd gotten lost driving home. She tried to bribe Mr. Jenkins, the neighbor, to say he'd seen Margaret acting confused. He refused, and instead wrote a letter for Margaret's case, describing her as the most competent and clear-headed person I know. Margaret was grateful, but she knew Rachel wouldn't stop there. One afternoon, as Margaret was reviewing her notes, she received a call from Mark. "I've filed motions to exclude any hearsay about your mental state," he said. We have Dr. Patel's evaluation, Mr. Jenkins' letter, and the notarized statement from George. But Rachel's lawyer is aggressive. They'll try to rattle you on the stand. Be ready for anything, Margaret nodded, her resolve hardening. I'm ready, Mark. I won't let them take my home. Victoria squeezed her hand. You're stronger than you think, Margaret. You've already won by standing up for yourself. But Margaret knew the stakes. If this plan failed, she could lose everything, her home, her independence, her dignity. She spent the evenings walking through the house, touching the walls, the photographs, the quilt Henry's mother had made. She whispered promises to herself, to Henry, to Lily. She would not give up. She would not be erased. As the trial drew closer, Margaret's days became a blur of preparation and anxiety. She met with Mark in his office, going over every detail of her testimony, rehearsing answers to the questions she knew Rachel's lawyer would ask. Mark was thorough, but he was also kind, reminding her to breathe, to trust herself, to remember that the truth was on her side. Victoria sat in on the meetings, taking notes and offering encouragement. Her presence a steady anchor in the storm. Lily continued to help, scanning documents, organizing files, and even creating a timeline of events that Mark said would be invaluable in court. Margaret marveled at her granddaughter's determination, her quiet strength. "You're my hero, Grandma," Lily said one evening as they worked side by side at the kitchen table. "You're showing me what it means to fight for what's right." But the tension in the house was palpable. Margaret found herself jumping at every unexpected sound, double-checking every lock, every window. She started sleeping with her phone on the nightstand, just in case. She knew Rachel was watching, waiting for her to slip up. She saw Rachel's car parked down the street more often, saw her talking to neighbors, sometimes even caught her peering through the hedge. Margaret refused to be intimidated, but the constant vigilance wore on her. Rachel's efforts to sabotage Margaret's case grew more desperate. She tried to contact Dr. Patel, hoping to sway his evaluation. She sent anonymous letters to the court, full of half-truths and outright lies. She even tried to turn Lily against her grandmother, telling her that Margaret was confused and didn't know what she was doing. But Lily stood firm, refusing to be manipulated. Margaret's allies rallied around her. Mr. Jenkins organized a neighborhood petition in support of Margaret, gathering signatures from friends and neighbors who had known her for decades. The pastor at church offered to testify on her behalf, describing her as a pillar of the community. Even Sarah, Margaret's estranged daughter, reached out, offering words of support and a promise to appear in court if needed. The night before the trial, Margaret sat alone in the living room, the house quiet except for the ticking of the old clock. She reviewed her notes one last time, her hands steady, her mind clear. She thought of Henry, of the life they had built together, of the promise she had made to protect their home. She thought of Lily, of Victoria, of all the people who believed in her. She knew the battle would be hard, that she might lose more than just the house. But she also knew she wasn't alone. As she prepared for bed, Margaret found a note slipped under her door. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was unmistakable. "Back down or you'll regret it." Margaret stared at the note, her heart pounding. For a moment, the old fear threatened to return, but she pushed it aside. She was done being intimidated. She tucked the note into her journal, another piece of evidence for Mark. She stood at the window, looking out at the quiet street, the moonlight casting long shadows across the lawn. She whispered a promise to herself, to Henry, to everyone who had ever doubted her. "I will not give up. I will not be erased. Tomorrow I fight." The morning of the trial dawned gray and cold, the sky heavy with the threat of rain. Margaret dressed with care, choosing a navy skirt and a soft white blouse, her mother's brooch pinned at her collar. She looked in the mirror and saw a woman who had survived heartbreak, loss, and now betrayal. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked out the door, Victoria and Lily at her side. The courthouse was already buzzing when they arrived. Reporters lingered on the steps, neighbors whispered in the hallways, and the courtroom itself was packed, family, friends, and strangers, all drawn by the spectacle of a family tearing itself apart. Margaret felt their eyes on her as she entered, but she kept her gaze steady, her steps measured. She would not let them see her fear. Rachel and Daniel sat at the plaintiff's table, their lawyer beside them. Rachel's expression was cold, her lips pressed into a thin line. Daniel looked tired, his eyes darting around the room, never quite meeting Margaret's. Lily sat behind them, her face pale but determined. Victoria and Mark, Margaret's lawyer, sat with her, offering quiet words of encouragement. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. He looked at Margaret, his eyes lingering for a moment before he spoke. "Mrs. Thompson, I must admit I'm surprised to see you here. I've known your family for many years." Margaret nodded, her voice steady. "Thank you, Your Honor. I'm here to tell the truth." The proceedings began. Rachel's lawyer stood first, painting a picture of Margaret as a frail, confused woman unable to care for herself or her property. He cited concerns about her memory, her ability to manage finances, and her increasing isolation. Rachel nodded along, her eyes glinting with satisfaction. Margaret listened. Her hands folded in her lap, her heart pounding. She wanted to shout, to protest, but she waited. She knew her turn would come. Daniel was called to the stand. He spoke in a low voice, describing his mother as forgetful, overwhelmed, and in need of help. He talked about missed appointments, misplaced bills, and the burden of maintaining the house. Margaret felt each word like a blow, but she refused to look away. Rachel took the stand next. She was poised, her answers rehearsed. "We only want what's best for Margaret," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "We're worried about her safety. The house is too much for her. We just want her to be comfortable." The judge listened, his expression unreadable. When Rachel finished, Mark stood and began his cross-examination. "Mrs. Thompson, do you have any evidence that Margaret is unable to care for herself?" Rachel hesitated. "Well, she's left the stove on a few times. She's gotten lost driving home. Do you have any documentation of these incidents? Police reports? Medical records?" Rachel faltered. "No, but thank you." No further questions. Margaret's turn came. She stood, her hands trembling only slightly as she took the oath. Mark guided her through her testimony, asking about her daily routines, her finances, her relationships. Margaret answered clearly, describing how she managed her bills, maintained the house, and stayed active in the community. She spoke of her garden, her volunteer work, her friendships. Mark presented the evidence: the original deed, Henry's letter, the security footage of Rachel rifling through the recycling, the emails Lily had found, the letter from Dr. Patel attesting to Margaret's mental fitness. He called neighbors and friends, each one describing Margaret as sharp, independent, and fully capable. Then came the turning point. Mark played the security footage for the court. The room watched in silence as Rachel appeared on the screen, digging through Margaret's recycling, pocketing documents. Mark presented the stills, the missing bank statement, the insurance letter. Rachel's face went pale. The judge leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Mrs. Thompson, can you explain why you were searching through your mother-in-law's personal papers?" Rachel stammered, her composure slipping. "I was just trying to help. I thought she might have misplaced something important." Mark pressed on. "Is it true you asked Dr. Patel to declare Margaret incompetent, even though he found no evidence of cognitive decline?" Rachel's voice shook. "I was worried. Or were you trying to build a case to take her home?" The judge intervened. "That's enough. Mrs. Thompson, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Margaret stood, her voice clear and strong. "Your Honor, I have spent my life caring for my family. I have managed this house, my finances, and my health without help. I am not helpless. I am not incompetent. I am here because I refuse to be erased from my own life." The judge nodded, his face grave. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson." The courtroom was silent. Daniel looked down, shame flickering across his face. Lily reached for Margaret's hand, squeezing it tightly. Victoria smiled, tears in her eyes. Rachel's lawyer tried to recover, but the damage was done. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony damning. The judge called a recess, his voice heavy with the weight of what he had heard. During the recess, the courtroom buzzed with whispers and speculation. Margaret sat quietly at the defense table, her hands folded in her lap, her mind replaying every word, every look, every moment that had led to this day. She glanced at Lily, who offered a reassuring smile, and at Victoria, who squeezed her shoulder. Mark leaned in, his voice low and steady. "You did beautifully, Margaret." The judge saw the truth. Now we just have to hold our ground. Across the aisle, Rachel was in heated conversation with her lawyer, her face flushed with anger and fear. Daniel sat slumped in his chair, his head in his hands, the weight of his choices finally settling on his shoulders. Margaret felt a pang of sadness for her son, but she knew she couldn't save him from the consequences of his actions. He would have to find his own way back. When the judge returned, the room fell silent once more. He called Rachel back to the stand. "Mrs. Thompson, you've been accused of tampering with evidence and attempting to manipulate medical testimony. Do you have anything further to say?" Rachel's voice was barely audible. "I was just trying to protect my family. I thought I was doing the right thing." The judge's gaze was stern. "Protecting your family does not mean destroying someone else's life. The evidence shows a clear pattern of manipulation and deceit. This court does not take such actions lightly." Mark called Lily to the stand. She spoke with quiet conviction, describing her grandmother's daily routines, her sharp memory, her kindness and independence. "My grandma is the strongest person I know," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "She's always been there for us. She doesn't deserve this." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as she listened to Lily's testimony. She realized in that moment that she was not alone. She had allies, people who believed in her, who were willing to stand up and tell the truth. The judge asked Margaret one final question. "Mrs. Thompson, if the court rules in your favor, what will you do?" Margaret took a deep breath. "I will continue to live in my home. I will care for my garden, volunteer at the community center, and spend time with my family, those who want to be part of my life. I will not hold grudges, but I will not forget what has happened here. I hope we can all learn from this and move forward." The judge nodded, clearly moved by her words. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson." As the closing arguments began, Margaret listened intently. Mark spoke with passion and clarity, laying out the facts, the evidence, the truth. Rachel's lawyer tried to sow doubt, to paint Margaret as stubborn and unreasonable, but the case was already lost. The truth was too strong, the evidence too clear. When the judge announced that he would deliver his verdict the next morning, a hush fell over the courtroom. Margaret felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her, but also a sense of relief. She had done everything she could. The outcome was out of her hands now. As she left the courthouse, Margaret glanced back at Rachel and Daniel. Rachel's face was hard, her eyes cold. Daniel looked lost, a man adrift in a storm of his own making. Margaret felt a surge of compassion for him, but she knew she couldn't fix what was broken between them, not yet. Outside, the sky was clearing, the sun breaking through the clouds. Margaret took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the day lift from her shoulders. She was tired, but she was also free. She had told her story, fought her battle, and reclaimed her life. No one expected what happened next. The judge's decision would change everything. But for now, Margaret allowed herself a moment of peace, a moment to savor the strength she had found within herself. The next morning, Margaret woke before dawn, her heart pounding with anticipation and dread. She dressed in her favorite cardigan, the one Henry had always said brought out the blue in her eyes, and made herself a cup of tea. The house was quiet, the air heavy with the weight of what was to come. She sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around her mug, and tried to steady her nerves. Today, everything would change, one way or another. Victoria arrived just after sunrise, her presence a balm to Margaret's frayed nerves. "No matter what happens, you've already won," she whispered, squeezing Margaret's hand. Lily joined them, her eyes bright with hope. "You're the bravest person I know, Grandma." "I'm so proud of you." Margaret smiled, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. Whatever the judge decided, she knew she had already reclaimed something precious, her own sense of worth. The courthouse was packed when they arrived. Neighbors, friends, and even a few strangers had come to witness the outcome. Margaret walked in with her head held high, her steps steady. She felt the eyes on her, but this time she didn't shrink from their gaze. She was no longer the frightened woman who had been blindsided by betrayal. She was Margaret Thompson, mother, grandmother, survivor. The judge entered, his expression grave. He looked at Margaret, then at Rachel and Daniel, and finally at the assembled crowd. "This case has been difficult," he began, his voice steady. "It is never easy to see a family divided, to witness the pain that comes when trust is broken. But the law is clear, and the evidence is overwhelming." He turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Thompson, you have demonstrated not only your competence, but your resilience, your integrity, and your unwavering commitment to your family and your home. The court finds in your favor. The house remains yours, and all attempts to remove you from it must cease immediately." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, relief and joy flooding her heart. She looked at Lily, who grinned and threw her arms around her. Victoria hugged her tightly, whispering, "You did it, Margaret. You did it." The judge wasn't finished. He turned to Rachel and Daniel, his tone stern. "Your actions have caused unnecessary pain and division. The court strongly recommends family counseling and urges you to reflect on the consequences of your choices. This is not just a legal matter, it is a matter of the heart." Rachel's face was pale, her eyes downcast. Daniel looked at Margaret, shame and regret etched into his features. For a moment, Margaret saw the boy he had once been, the son she had loved so fiercely. She felt a pang of sadness for what had been lost, but also a glimmer of hope for what might still be repaired. As the courtroom emptied, people stopped to congratulate Margaret, to shake her hand, to thank her for her courage. Mr. Jenkins pressed a note into her palm. "You reminded us all what real strength looks like." The pastor from church hugged her, promising to visit soon. Even Sarah, her estranged daughter, called to say how proud she was. But the most surprising moment came when Daniel approached her, his eyes brimming with tears. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I let you down. I let Rachel come between us. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want to try to make things right." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, her heart aching with love and sorrow. "We can't change the past, Daniel, but we can choose what we do next. I want to try too." As they left the courthouse, Margaret felt lighter than she had in years. She had fought for her home, her dignity, and her place in the family, and she had won. But she knew the story wasn't over yet. There were still wounds to heal, relationships to mend, and a future to build. The days that followed were filled with a quiet, almost surreal sense of relief. Margaret returned home to find her neighbors had left flowers on her porch and a casserole waiting in her fridge. She moved through her house with a new appreciation for every creak in the floorboards, every sunbeam that filtered through the curtains. The fear that had haunted her for months was gone, replaced by a cautious hope. She spent long afternoons in her garden, tending the roses and thinking about the future, not just the past. Daniel began to visit more often, sometimes bringing Lily, sometimes coming alone. Their conversations were awkward at first, full of apologies and silences, but gradually they found their way back to each other. Margaret forgave him, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She saw the regret in his eyes, the way he tried to make amends, and she knew that healing would take time. Rachel, for her part, kept her distance. She sent a letter of apology, but Margaret sensed it was more about saving face than true remorse. Still, she accepted it, choosing to let go of the bitterness that had threatened to consume her. One evening, as Margaret was closing up the house, she heard a knock at the door. It was Sarah, her estranged daughter, holding a small suitcase and looking uncertain. "I heard what happened, Mom. I'm sorry I wasn't here for you. Can I stay for a while?" Margaret welcomed her in, her heart swelling with gratitude. They sat together late into the night, sharing stories, laughter, and tears. For the first time in years, Margaret felt her family coming back together. Not perfectly, not all at once, but in small, hopeful steps. The community center where Margaret volunteered offered her a new opportunity to lead a support group for women facing family betrayal and legal battles. At first she hesitated, unsure if she was ready to share her story so publicly. But Lily encouraged her, reminding her of the strength she had shown. Margaret agreed, and soon found herself surrounded by women who saw her not just as a survivor, but as a guide. She listened to their stories, offered advice, and found healing in helping others. One afternoon, as she was preparing for a group meeting, Margaret received a letter in the mail. It was from Henry's old friend, a lawyer who had helped draft the original deed to the house. Inside was a note. "Henry always said you were the strongest person he knew. He'd be proud of you. Tucked inside was a copy of the deed, annotated with Henry's handwriting, a final, loving reassurance that the home was always meant to be hers. Margaret smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks. She realized that her journey wasn't just about keeping a house or winning a court case. It was about reclaiming her voice, her dignity, and her place in the world. She had faced betrayal, fought for justice, and found redemption, not just for herself, but for her family. And as she stood in her garden, the sun setting behind her, Margaret knew she was finally home. Say, expand next section when you're ready for the next part. The weeks after the trial passed in a gentle, almost dreamlike haze. Margaret found herself waking each morning with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. The house, once a battleground of anxiety and suspicion, was now a sanctuary again. She moved through her days with a new lightness, savoring the small rituals that had always brought her comfort. The first cup of tea at sunrise, the soft hum of the radio in the kitchen, the feel of earth between her fingers as she tended her garden. The fear of losing everything had been replaced by a quiet pride. She had stood her ground, and she had won. The family's dynamic shifted, slowly but unmistakably. Daniel visited more often, sometimes with Lily, sometimes alone. Their conversations were honest, sometimes painful, but always real. Margaret saw the effort he made to rebuild trust, to show her that he was sorry, that he wanted to be part of her life again. She forgave him, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She understood now that forgiveness was not a gift for the other person, but a release for herself. Rachel remained distant, her pride still a barrier, but Margaret no longer let it trouble her. She had learned that she could not control other people's choices, only her own. Sarah, too, became a more regular presence. She and Margaret spent long afternoons talking, laughing, and sometimes crying over old wounds. The sisters, once separated by years of misunderstanding, found their way back to each other. Margaret realized that family was not just about blood, but about the people who showed up, who listened, who cared. The community center became a place of healing, not just for Margaret, but for many others. She led her support group with compassion and wisdom, sharing her story and listening to others. Women came to her with their own tales of betrayal and resilience, and Margaret found strength in their courage. She saw herself reflected in their struggles, and she offered them the hope that had carried her through her darkest days. One afternoon, as she was preparing for a group meeting, Margaret received a letter in the mail. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words inside were full of gratitude. "Your story gave me the courage to stand up for myself," the letter read. "Thank you for reminding me that it's never too late to fight for what's right." Margaret smiled, her heart full. She realized that her journey had become more than just her own. It was a beacon for others, a reminder that even in the face of betrayal, there was always a way forward. Margaret often reflected on the lessons she had learned. She understood now that standing up for herself was not selfish, but necessary. She realized that her worth was not defined by her family's approval, but by her own sense of dignity and self-respect. She knew that the past could not be changed, but the future was hers to shape. As the seasons changed and the garden bloomed anew, Margaret felt a sense of hope for what was to come. She looked forward to new adventures, to deepening friendships, to the simple joys of each day. She knew there would be challenges ahead, but she faced them with confidence, knowing that she had already survived the worst. Would you have done the same? Margaret often wondered how others would have handled her situation. Would they have fought or would they have given in? She hoped her story would inspire others to find their own strength, to stand up for themselves, to believe that it was never too late to reclaim their lives. One evening, as the sun set over her garden, Margaret heard a knock at the door. She opened it to find Lily, holding a small envelope. "This came for you, Grandma," she said, her eyes shining. Inside was an invitation to speak at a women's conference, an opportunity to share her story with an even wider audience. Margaret smiled, feeling the promise of a hopeful future. She stepped out onto the porch, the cool air brushing her face, and looked up at the stars. She was no longer afraid. She was Margaret Thompson, strong, resilient, and ready for whatever came next. If you've made it to the end of my story, I want to ask you something from the heart. What would you have done in my place? If your own family tried to take away everything you'd built, would you have fought back, or would you have walked away to keep the peace? Have you ever faced a betrayal so deep it made you question everything you thought you knew about the people you love? Maybe you've been the quiet backbone of your family, always giving, always putting others first, until one day you realized you were being pushed aside. I know I'm not the only one who's felt invisible, underestimated, or betrayed by those closest to me. Maybe you've been through something similar, a family dispute, a painful divorce, a moment when you had to stand up for yourself even though it meant standing alone. Maybe you're still in the middle of it, wondering if you have the strength to keep going. If so, I want you to know, you are not alone. Your story matters. Your voice matters. Share your story in the comments below. Tell us about a time you had to fight for your dignity, your home, or your happiness. Your words might be the encouragement someone else needs to take their first step toward healing. If you've ever felt the sting of betrayal or the triumph of reclaiming your life, let us know. This community is here to listen, to support, and to remind you that you are stronger than you think. And if you found something in my story that resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with a friend, a sister, a neighbor, anyone who might need a reminder that it's never too late to stand up for yourself. Don't miss our next story. Subscribe for more true tales of courage, justice, and redemption. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be erased. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for believing that every woman's story deserves to be heard.